For my family folklore assignment, I interviewed my father along with his siblings and anyone from his side of the family that I could get in contact with, anyone that he is still in contact with. I was in search of a narrative, a story that I could share here with archetypes, a fable of some sort that I could pass down that maybe my grandma had told her kids, my dad. But what I found wasn't a narrative. What I found wasn't a fable. What I found weren't characters in a story. What I found was a broken history. What I found was generational trauma. What I found was stunted growth. And honestly, it's heartbreaking to see what I've learned through this project. And I know that the assignment in itself was to retell a story, but what I would really like to do here is share the story of essentially how my stories were stolen from me. My grandma was 10 or 11 years old when her and her family were sent to live in war relocation centers. That is a fancy way of saying that she grew up in a concentration camp. My grandfather did as well. They did not know each other at the time. They were children, but they both were sent to separate camps in Arizona. This was 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. My grandparents, both Japanese Americans, born in the States, they were sent to concentration camps solely because they were Japanese. My grandma only shared a story with me once. They didn't talk about it a lot. They didn't want to talk about it a lot. But the story that I remember her telling me was this fragmented, broken memory of doing simple, necessary tasks, like just using the restroom. She was a child at the time, and she would need to go, and there's just this row of toilets. No stalls, no doors, no separation between man and woman or child and adult, just a row of toilets. And she's this little girl slinking off to the end one just for this shred of privacy. It was traumatic for her. This life was traumatic for her. And in this other camp, miles away, my grandpa was a teenager at the time, maybe 14. And that's another trauma in itself, being that age. I took a trip to Manzanar with my family one year, another camp here in California. And the thing that strikes you first is the guard towers and the barbed wire. You really... It is undescribable. Trying to imagine being a literal child and just this idea that you do not belong and you are not wanted. My grandpa's pain grew even greater when a few years down the line his younger sister took her own life. She could not cope with her personhood being stripped away in that manner. And that translates to even more generational trauma. Because even after they were released with nothing. They were released with absolutely nothing. My grandpa worked his way in the strawberry fields until he had enough money saved up and stashed aside to open up his own gas station, his own American dream. And he and my grandma worked that gas station for years. She ran the books, she washed windows, she broke down tires for repairs. She was hands-on in that business. They were partners. And when my dad and his siblings were born, she took on another great role and she became a mom. And she was amazing at it. But that trauma doesn't end when you leave a camp. That trauma gets passed down. My grandpa could be mean. My grandpa could be very mean. and he never talked about his time at camp. But can you blame him? It took everything from him. It took his sister from him. My grandma didn't share stories often. She tried to push that time aside. She wanted to forget. When they got their reparations years later, they both spent their money on something that brought them joy, something that they could invest in that would take their pain and make it a little bit brighter. My grandpa invested money in a top-of-the-line, fresh-off-the-line, American-made car. That was his symbol of making it. My grandpa wholeheartedly believed in the American dream, the American ideal. He knew what it stood for. His parents had come here in search of a better life, and he still believed, after everything that he had endured, after everything that he had witnessed, he believed in the American dream and the American ideal. And to him, that car was his symbol of making it. He had seen the ugliest side of American culture, and he still knew he could thrive. He survived, and that was his symbol of survival. My grandma, on the other hand, she took that sum of money, and it was a meager amount of money compared to their 5 years behind barbed wire. But she took that sum of money and she took her entire family on a trip to Las Vegas. I was there. I was a toddler at the time. I vaguely remember it. The one memory I have of this trip is being in her arms and just sobbing because the alligator at Rainforest Cafe looked too lifelike. That's how young I was. But that was her. She wanted to take that pain that she had endured. She wanted to take that pain that she felt and turn it into something beautiful for her family. That's who she was. That's who she was. Life was hard for my dad and his siblings. You know, inside the home, there was strife. There was difficulties inside the home, you know. You have two parents who endured trauma and other mental instability, and it's unstable. But outside of the home, there were struggles as well. My dad got into a lot of fights growing up. He was deemed angry and irrational, easily agitated. But on the playground, he was getting mocked relentlessly. People mocking his appearance, people throwing actual slurs around behind his back. Yeah, he'd get in fights, but you have to be aware of the idea that his identity, his personhood was being mocked at every single turn, being pushed back at every single turn. And that weighs on him. And that weighed on his siblings. And that weight got passed down too. And so you have to wonder, what does this say about generational strife and what it passes down? I was too young to know what any of this meant growing up. When I was growing up, I mean, I've always known I'm half Japanese, but it was never really talked about. It was never really celebrated. And that's because even after my grandparents were released from these concentration camps, they were forced to assimilate. They were forced to renounce their citizenship. They were forced to declare themselves solely Americans. Because they could be seen as potential threats, potential terrorists. So they assimilated. And they made sure that their kids were assimilated as well. So it wasn't until I was a little bit older that I started to notice these things. Kids on my schoolyard mocking the way my dad looked, or making comments to me when they found out who my dad was and what he looked like. The Circle 1 on ethnicity and race questionnaires, when, you know, one never really applied. Or even worse, just this constant internal war waged between both sides of my heritage. It was rough, and that stems from decades, half a century of trauma being passed down. Things were hard for my grandparents, but they rebuilt. They built a community for themselves and for their kids, and in turn for me. My dad told me that both of my grandparents were extremely religious, and they found community through that. My grandma was a devout Christian. She took herself and all of her kids to church every Sunday. They went to Sunday school, and they found community there. They found camaraderie there. My grandpa, on the other hand, was a devout Buddhist. There was a mix of traditions in their household. My father recounts a story of him and his siblings. My grandpa had this tradition where on New Year's you would turn on every single light in the house for the entire day. He would say, a bright house on New Year's makes for a bright life for the entire year. That was his tradition. So my dad recounts the story of following him around the house as he was turning on all the lights and flicking them off one by one, just to piss off his dad, in all honesty. But he laughs recalling it. We always do. And now those are the types of stories that I get to pass down. So I may never know what came before my grandparents. I may never get to know the stories that got my grandparents through the hardest parts of their lives. But I do get to know the stories in which my grandparents are the heroes. I may not have narratives about trickster rabbits, evil serpents, archetypes of everyday heroes, but my grandparents are the everyday heroes. They struggled and they persisted. There's the American dream hidden in every layer of this story. The underbelly of our society, and yet still having faith in what it can mean and what we can become. I don't know the stories that my grandma told, but now I get to tell hers, and that is my family folklore. Every picture that is in the slideshow for this is a picture that I have of my grandma, my grandpa, and her family. These are our stories. This is our new narrative. Our history may be broken in places, but it goes on from here because I will continue to tell it. So even though I do not have a narrative to share here, I can tell you this. Every New Year, from here on out, we will come together. We will eat our traditional food, the sushi, the wontons, my grandma's famous strawberry pie. We will take trips to Disneyland just for her, and we will leave the lights on for one another every New Year. Because that's what we do. We survive, and we rebuild, and we find community in one another.